Welcome to episode 25. You are trapped in history with me, your host, Robbie Malcolmson. Tonight's episode is entitled The Middle of the Protestant Reformation. Now, if you haven't had an opportunity yet, for context and for prior knowledge, make sure to go back a couple episodes and watch episode 23 or listen to episode 23. And that episode is entitled The Beginning of the Reformation. And that way you have the proper background going into this episode to help you out as a listener, a student, or a teacher. Now, in today's episode, we will examine the turbulent middle years of the Protestant Reformation, focusing on key events like the end of the Diet of Worms, the trial of Martin Luther's excommunication from the Catholic Church, King Henry VIII of England, his reaction to Luther, his subsequent divorce request from the Pope, his separation from the Catholic Church, and the establishment of the Anglican Church, and more importantly and transcendentally, him claiming himself as the head of the church, combining the state and religion together. Now, after that, we see the publication of Thomas More's book, Utopia, his subsequent execution by Henry VIII, the beginning of the Catholic Counter-Reformation, so the Catholic Church will respond to these new movements of like Luther and Calvin and Zwingli and them. And finally, the wars of religion, as we kind of get towards the conclusion of the unit. Now, if you would like to have a deeper dive on the wars of religion, I recorded that early on episode 9 because I had a teacher reach out to me and say they would like me to do an episode where I focus deeper on that topic. So I've already done a deep dive on that, so I'm just going to do a general overview in this episode because you can go back to episode 9 and hit that one a lot stronger. And that's something I intend on doing next year. I'm going to go through these more overview kind of episodes to help myself as an educator. But in the future, we can spotlight and do deep dives into specific topics and then talk about causation and continuity and change and contextualization and all these other connections that we can make to it, and do the best that we can at bringing in any kind of events and ideas and people before the event and after the event that may connect to that particular topic. And I would love to have some of these friends that I'm making that are coming on for interviews or other teachers to come on and help team teach those with me. It would be great to do like a roundtable sort of discussion for those type of episodes. So as usual, we move to our segment for the quote of the week. The quote of the week is from John Calvin, a famous French Protestant theologian, someone that was inspired by Luther and by Zwingli. And he will inspire a group of Protestants in northern France called the Huguenots or the Huguenots, if you want to pronounce it like that. And of course, they will be a major factor there in the wars of religion in terms of the wars of the three Henrys and other things going on up there in France during that Reformation. A lot of, imagine Europe here as being just ripped apart from within because of religious issues and social upheaval and economic inequality. There's lots of reasons for why there's social unrest, but the religious fabric of Europe is definitely being torn to shreds here, and people are having to make very, very difficult decisions, as we heard that on the last episode. So the quote for John Calvin is an interesting one. It's very short. He famously says, "We must remember that Satan has his miracles too." And the context and significance of this quote by John Calvin reflects his belief in the pervasive influence of evil and deceit in the world, even within his own Christian community, or the Christian community in general throughout Europe. Now, Calvin as a key figure in the Protestant Reformation, some historians, some teachers would even argue that Calvin has a greater effect in the long run than what Luther did. And this is something that could be debated later. And maybe I revisit that later with people where we make those arguments. But anyway, Calvin emphasized the doctrine of predestination, this belief that whenever you're born, your soul's already decided on whether you will go to heaven or whether you go to hell and whatnot, and the absolute sovereignty of God, often warning his followers about the dangers of false teachings and temptations. Now think about that word sovereignty, and you will hear that often too in a U.S. history class with popular sovereignty and whatnot. Sovereignty being like on your own, being able to make your own decisions. And in this case, like the God is the one God. And I go back and I think of the meaning of paintings like the creation of Adam on the Sistine Chapel, is that even though God and Adam are the same sort of size and proportion in the painting, God is higher than Adam. And that's one of those things in these faith-based religions of Islam and Christianity and Judaism. The human being cannot be equal to God. If you do that, you then humanize God and then bring him down to the level of a human. And therefore, it's not the deity that it is anymore and doesn't have the same meaning. And then more importantly, to tie back to our last episode and provide that continuity throughout the unit. Like Zwingli and like Luther, Calvin is warning these followers against the false teachings and temptations that I said earlier, these things like the sale of indulgences and these sacraments, these other actions that they're doing, these unethical behaviors that maybe preachers and monks are doing, and interpretations or misinterpretations of Scripture. So like Luther and Zwingli, he wants to take a step back to more of a traditional view of Scripture, to be more grounded in that. And that way, hopefully, it has the least likely of an ability to corrupt or to lead to greed or other issues like that. Now, this quote from him, that we must remember that Satan has his miracles too, it illustrates that Calvin's view of spiritual battle between good and evil, which was actually the central idea to his theology and his further reform efforts. And remember, reform being one of the main word of the unit, right, is these changes, these amendments that you're trying to make to a system that's already been there for hundreds of years, but many feel like it's leading to corruption, it's leading to greed and other issues like that. You're leading followers astray, and they want to call this out. And remember, Luther, he's trying with the 95 Theses to help change this from within. His document, written originally in Latin, that's intended for an audience that is highly educated, especially in Scripture. So this is where the clergy is supposed to be reading that and hopefully changing it from within. And of course, they're not going to make those changes from within. And that's part of the reason why in this episode, eventually, after this movement becomes even more shockingly popular to the Catholic Church, they will do the Catholic Counter-Reformation and try to respond to many of these criticisms and claims and try to help protect their prestige and their image and reputation amongst other Europeans and others around the world. So it also underscores the challenges he perceived in maintaining a pure, true faith amidst a growing religious conflict and the proliferation of divergent doctrines. And divergent being like splitting apart. Because remember we said earlier is that, if you're a Christian, you're one type of Christianity, you're Catholic. But after Luther, you get that first split between Protestantism and Catholic. And now the rest of the time, we're going to see even more splits because, of course, you're going to get that whenever with humanism and individualism, when you get the encouragement of interpreting Scripture individually, you're going to get multiple interpretations, and inevitably you are going to get different kind of denominations. We had this Socratic seminar discussion yesterday. So in episode 23, if you go down to the notes, you can see all these open-ended philosophical questions that you could do in a seminar with your students as a way to introduce the unit, get them thinking about change. What's the risk of criticizing any type of authority in public, on that kind of stuff. And it was a great discussion with my class, my second AP class, on that one. And I look forward to doing with my other AP class on Monday. Now, this quote, it can serve as a compelling point of discussion about Calvinist beliefs, the broader context of the Reformation, and the role of religious authority and interpretation in shaping early modern Europe. John Calvin frequently wrote about the concept of deception and false miracles in several of his works. And so that goes along consistently with the criticisms that Luther and Zwingli had been having about the Catholic Church along the way as well. Now, for examples of these works that he criticized, I have two of them. So you have Institutes of, well, I'll just do one of those just for sake of time. So we'll do the Institutes of the Christian Religion, a document in 1536 that was published. Within this foundational text, John Calvin discusses the nature of true faith and the deceptions of false teachings throughout, particularly in Book 1 and in Book 4. he emphasizes that Satan often disguises his works to appear as divine miracles, which lead people astray. And I think that is a perfect tie-in to the 95 Theses, because if you start off with the 95 Theses, which I would recommend to do so early on there, you can then bring this document in as a primary source analysis and then keep it right there with the 95 Theses, have students discuss maybe some of the similarities and differences between those two. And they can find some similarities there between the criticisms that Luther had and what John Calvin had. Now, the document and source of the week. This is going to be from a major figure in this part of the unit, and that is King Henry VIII, the King of England at the time. And he does this document that I cannot, and I am embarrassingly admit, that I have not used in class my first 5 years. And this summer, doing more research and watching other AP teachers and whatnot, I have to give credit to other people. I really should have been using a document called the Act of Supremacy that was published in 1534, because this is a transcendental document. This is a document that really sets a precedent for other monarchs with their relationship to the church, or as we would say in the class, this relationship between the state and the church going forward. Now, in this document, one of the quotes that he says, "Albeit the King's Majesty justly and rightfully is and ought to be the supreme head of the Church of England." That is a very radical thing to say. You would have said that, when the Church of England was correlated with the Catholic Church, you obviously have the Pope, and the Pope is the main interpreter of the Bible throughout Europe, throughout that Christian world, or Christendom, if you want to think of it in terms of that, the Christian kingdoms. So Henry VIII doing this as well. And as I tell my students, this isn't like a tiny country with a king or queen separating themselves from the church and really creating this isolated incident that's not going to be as big of a deal as this would be. This is England, and you cannot forget that, remember, they're starting to do the Age of Exploration as well. They're colonizing, they're settling places in the world, just like the Dutch Republic, France, Portugal, Spain, and others. And for them to separate themselves from the Catholic Church, that is a huge deal. That is extremely significant, because that could set a precedent for other groups later. And I know this is kind of comparing apples to oranges, but for some reason it makes me think of there in the late 2000 teens when Brexit happened. Some people freak out. Okay, Great Britain leaves the European Union. Could this cause a chain reaction? Could this cause the European Union to just inevitably fail for other countries to break away from that? And so you got to think about that here too, but in more of a religious sense with these kingdoms and whatnot. So this is for context. Remember, this is a very important change of events for the reputation for the Church of England, for the reputation of Henry, for the reputation of the Pope and the Catholic Church. Because as we've seen these first two units here, the Catholic Church at the time are taking some massive reputational hits here and definitely affecting their prestige. And part of that Catholic Counter-Reformation is to really address that and repair many of these concerns and prop up the interpretation and the power and authority of the Catholic Church. Now, let me go back to this document here. The Act of Supremacy, like I said, it's probably one of the few documents that I'll use a huge chunk of the document as the source on there. But an overview of that would be that the Act of Supremacy was a piece of legislation. So this is a law here, passed by English Parliament under Henry VIII, declaring the king as the supreme head of the Church of England. So think about what that line there means is like legislation. So think about that intended audience. This is meant for everyone in England. And remember, the majority of people in England are Catholic at this time. So they're being told by their king, who they must obey on there, that they now have to transition over to the Protestant religion. And now you went from listening to someone like the Pope or someone on that level, now to Henry VIII. And don't get me wrong, Henry VIII is a very intelligent individual. He could speak multiple languages. He was very skilled in athletics and in hunting and whatnot. So he was in a way, he was kind of a Renaissance man in some ways. But being the head of the Church of England, being the king and like this religious leader, that is extremely unusual, and it will be radical, and it will be very divisive around England. And like I said earlier, this being a transcendental document that further sets a precedent for other maybe absolute monarchs to claim something later called the divine right of kings. And I know that King James I is the one that's going to coin that phrase for the first time. But obviously here, it's not just King Henry is like saying something like that. He is actually doing it through his actions, like by placing himself there. It's not just as simple as him saying, I also enforce the rules of God on earth, but I'm also this interpretation of the church itself. So very radical. So one of his friends, a famous writer, Thomas More, is extremely critical about this. And we're going to see him, publicly criticize him as a very well-known philosopher, respected intellectual within England. And Henry will respond by having him executed. Again, really anytime back then, questioning any kind of major authority, as my AP class discussed yesterday, is maybe not so great for your head at the time and anything else going on. So it takes an extreme amount of courage to be able to speak up and criticize a religious authority or a royal authority in that matter. So again, not a lot of fair trials going on at this particular time. So the significance of the document of the Act of Supremacy, again, a document that I highly recommend you as a new teacher to try to weave into Unit 2. And this act, this legislation, formally broke England away from the Roman Catholic Church, and it marked the beginning of what we call the English Reformation. And it was driven by, of course, Henry VIII's desire for an annulment, a divorce from his marriage, his wife. So he was married to Catherine of Aragon for around 13 years. He wants a divorce from her because, he cares a lot about having an heir. And up to this point, he hasn't been able to successfully maintain and have a male yet as a baby. So that's when Anne Boleyn comes in there. You have the stories of her like promising a boy. He leaves Catherine to try to marry Anne Boleyn. We don't have to go super far into the multiple wives part because I think that we need to take more of a greater look at him politically and then his role in setting a precedent for the future there throughout Europe. So, but anyway, the Pope, of course, in the Catholic Church is going to refuse to grant Henry VIII because they're going to have a strong stance against any kind of divorce. And this act also demonstrated the increasing role of the national sovereignty over religious matters. And that's a huge key point here, is that an act like this sets a precedent for later by saying that, hey, this is where you're going to start seeing more monarchies, more governments and nation states start stepping away from leaning into the church for advice or permission or having support from the Pope. And yes, having support from the Pope always helps on that kind of thing because religion is such a key part of the culture in Europe, but you're now going to start seeing a lot of kings and queens push beyond that. Therefore, as a consequence, reducing the amount of political influence that the Catholic Church has. So as you're going through Unit 3 as well, and in Unit 4 later, even into like the French Revolution of Unit 5, you're seeing more and more the overall political influence of the Catholic Church throughout Europe and throughout the world for that matter is slowly but surely decreasing, especially in the way that it used to be in the Middle Ages. Now, the last part of analysis of this document, then we'll move on to the main part, is this document illustrates the political motivations behind religious changes during the Reformation, highlighting the merging of political and religious power. It also marks a shift towards the centralization of authority. That is a key phrase there for Unit 3 when we're looking into absolutism and constitutionalism. And as well as the centralization of authority, it leads to the creation of a new national church that catered to the monarch's desires. So obviously here, interpretation of Scripture is going to correlate with what's going to meet the desires of the king. And again, you see this throughout history. You see pastors in Nazi Germany being pressured by superiors and whatnot to use Scripture, to use their sermons as a way to prop up Nazi fascist ideology. And this is one of those times where you say again that you can justifiably look at religion with a critical or suspicious eye when in terms of how it's used in a political manner. And this is something you can see all throughout history in many religions on there. Okay, so let's move on to the main segment of the night, the general overview of these main topics in the middle of the Reformation. And we're going to start with the Diet of Worms. We mentioned this in episode 23. So Luther writes the 95 Theses. He is publicly starting to be criticized. He's trying to defend his reputation. And so the Pope, he has Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, put him on trial, basically. And Luther has to go against representatives from the church, and he has to try to defend himself. And at this meeting, this Diet of Worms, which again, it's the trial of Luther, but there's also other issues that are going on there, like addressing the Ottoman Empire concern and the spread of Islam. And it takes actually precedent before dealing with the Luther issue. So Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, has a lot of issues on his mind that he's trying to address right now for the Holy Roman Empire and other Europeans. But at the Diet of Worms, this is an event in 1521. So we have like a handful of years after the 95 Theses. And the Diet of Worms marks the Holy Roman Empire's attempt to address the growing religious divide that was sparked by Luther's 95 Theses. And Luther's refusal at this meeting to recant his views, recant meaning to take back publicly what he had believed before, this leads ultimately to Pope Leo X excommunicating him from the Catholic Church, being declared basically an outlaw. And in today's terms, it would be like this like sort of fugitive look, or maybe even like a terrorist. I mean, in many ways, maybe if you look at the complaints by his critics, they make him out to be like a terrorist leader in a way. And that's why when the peasant revolts start, Luther gets a lot of that blame, and he has to respond with documents like one of my favorite titles of a document, the murdering, thieving hordes of the peasants. And I might just do a whole spotlight episode, a short one on that one, just because it's, it's very, very blunt and very harsh towards the peasants, because, to him, they're taking their criticisms, they're doing it, and they're acting out and protesting in a very unethical way on that. Luther also tries to write to Henry VIII, because Henry VIII is trying to earn good graces from the Pope to keep his reputation up. He publicly criticizes Luther too, which is a major issue. Luther, having strong respect for Henry VIII, trying to repair his reputation. This is where it kind of gets odd, because Luther doesn't recant his words at the Diet of Worms in front of Charles V, but he eventually writes out to Henry VIII, basically pleading with him for like forgiveness and asking for his support. He even offers King Henry VIII to write a biography for him. And of course, Henry's not going to decide with him on that kind of stuff, because he wants to be able to protect his reputation. And then later on, Henry, of course, will have his beef with the Catholic Church and will break away from it as well for his own personal selfish reasons for that. Now, in terms of a historical skill here, we could think of things like causation for if you have to write about something in terms of Luther, the Diet of Worms for this part. So think of Luther's excommunication and how it increased his influence among German princes and reformers, further fracturing the church. So rather than stop this movement and calm it down, this is actually going to just lead to even more divisiveness and even more problems. And then you get into many reasons for the wars of religion in Europe, but I would definitely say this is going to further lead to the spark of not only the peasant revolts in Germany, but also in 1618, the 30 Years' War, this massive war between Protestants and Catholics in the middle of Europe. And it's going to be the deadliest war in European history up to that point. Key word there, up to that point, because obviously when we get to the world wars later, those will greatly outnumber that. But especially if you're a religiously committed person at that time, which in Europe the majority of people are, it's going to be a very heartbreaking time period to be in here, because you're seeing Christians basically just go after each other and kill each other. This is a very heartbreaking kind of moment for anybody in that Christian background. So let's move over to Henry VIII, since we already mentioned him a little here. So let's look at Henry VIII's reaction to Luther and his breakaway from the church. Initially a staunch Catholic, Henry VIII wrote The Defense of the Seven Sacraments, a document that I will put in my students' first DBQ that we're going to be breaking down soon. And this obviously opposes Luther publicly. However, after being denied an annulment by the Pope, by being denied that divorce request from the Pope, Henry will also break away from the Catholic Church later, leading to the formation of the new Anglican Church of England, this Protestant church that he is the head of. And he does that through the document we mentioned earlier, the Act of Supremacy. So this is where you can tie in continuity and change, another skill you need to be able to write on and think about. whenever you're in history. But again, not just getting ready for the AP exam, but for yourself as a critical thinker going forward in other history classes, in other parts of your education and your life. So think about Henry's shift from the defender of Catholic orthodoxy to a leader of a national church, a church controlled by the state, which showcases that changing religious landscape was definitely influenced by political motivations. So if you're asked on any kind of writing prompt, how was the Reformation influenced politically? Boom, you got it right there. You cannot overlook the importance of what Henry VIII does. So let's look at one of Henry VIII's friends, a confidant, someone that he will have executed on there, and that is Thomas More. And Thomas More writes a very important book at this time period that it's not in the illustrative examples of the class of our course guide, so it's not something that necessarily for sure would be on the AP exam, but it might show up on there someday, and that is Thomas More's Utopia, which is published in 1516, so right there before Luther does his 95 Theses. And within this book, he's going to present a vision of a perfect society, critiquing contemporary social, political, and religious practices within England at that time. And despite serving as Henry VIII's Lord Chancellor and friend, More will oppose the king's divorce, and he will break away. He will, and not just the divorce, but his break from the Pope and the break from Rome. He sees this as extremely bad for the reputation of him and for England. And this will subsequently lead to his famous execution for treason in 1535. And man, when we think of treason, we think of people that go against your country today, that spy on your country or something like that. In this case, you're going against the king. You cannot be publicly criticizing King Henry. And I would like to think that More, of course, knew what he was doing when he was doing this here. And I don't know whether or not he knew that Henry would have him executed, but that sets another precedent there too. That sets this tone that, this sends a message to the others in England too, that be careful about what you say, be careful about what you publish publicly. And then this brings out another historical skill, a very important one, called comparison. And this is where Utopia contrasts with the realities of the Reformation era in Europe and reveals the tension between idealism and realpolitik. And so you have this, and by realpolitik, I mean like that centralization of more power on the state. So again, this is the conflict between state and religion. And this is one of the reasons why, as Americans today, in our founding documents, we have the separation of church and state because of people like Thomas More and what he was advocating before, because of things like what we saw Henry do. We would not want to see the President of the United States be the leader of all the churches. Like, just imagine how well that would go over within the fabric of our country, especially in one that has the First Amendment in the Constitution. So anyway, let's move on to the Catholic Church's finally their response to this entire movement that's been going on this episode and a half, and that is the beginning of the Catholic Counter-Reformation. And think about what the word counter means. Like, think if you're watching like an MMA fight or something like that. If you're countering, you're like blocking something and then you're striking back at them. And we haven't done that yet. We really, other than putting Luther on trial here under Charles V's rule, we don't really have any response from the church yet, like offensively for that. So this is going to be their offensive maneuver and maybe somewhat defensive as well. So the Catholic Church initiated some new reforms, some changes to counter this new Protestant movement that is growing in popularity. And this included the establishment of new religious orders like the Jesuits of that and the Council of Trent, which reaffirmed Catholic doctrines and addresses the abuses. So for example, at the Council of Trent, the Catholic Church will finally remove indulgences. So there will no longer be the sale of indulgences, which was the main catalyst of Luther doing the 95 Theses. You're also going to make sure that all clergy members has to go to seminary school to be properly educated, to make sure that translation of Scripture as well. But another offensive move would be they make the official language of the Bible Latin, which then, as you know, further discredits other Bibles. So if you take like the Gutenberg Bible, remember Gutenberg's the guy with the printing press. If you take that first Bible there that was translated in German into vernacular, so that way more Germans in the German states of the Holy Roman Empire could interpret the Bible individually, and and that kind of factor. But So that's another way at further discrediting that. Like, hey, you might read those, but that's not the real scripture. That's not the valid one. This one's the real one, the Latin one. So you still see the church taking that offensive approach and trying to squash these other movements and these other interpretations of the Bible coming out. Because remember, your three original interpretations of the Bible were Greek, Hebrew, and Latin being like this dying language here. And again, your commoners are not able, especially the ones that are uneducated, are not able to speak Latin. And so that way you keep the translation of the Bible amongst the elite, the educated, the ones that were within the clergy. And they're not going to be supportive still of that individual relationship and interpretation of the Bible like the way the Protestants were pushing it. So continuity and change is another skill that you could use here. And you can think that the Catholic Church reformed some of these practices. It remained doctrinally rigid, though, and intensifying the religious divide. And that's why I was saying about the Bible being in Latin there, too. So in terms of doctrines, they're still going to be very rigid. And the Reformation doesn't do the job of necessarily getting rid of the Protestant Reformation part of it. Those movements still keep growing in popularity, but it may, for a while, slow down the damaging of the prestige of the Catholic Church. Obviously, getting rid of indulgences is an extremely important move on the Catholic Church's part. So let's move forward towards the middle. I'd say here, like I guess you'd say, some other chunks, these other important events that are somewhat smaller, but nonetheless important that we need to cover on here. So we're going to go from the 1520s all the way to the 1590s. So let's kind of wrap up that 1500s, 16th century period here. So some significant violent events that take place during this time period. And I'm going to focus on some of those major ones, and that is the German Peasants' War. I do a DBQ on that. I've offered that for the years. I have two different DBQs that I kind of alternate from, but one of them is the German Peasants DBQ that I got from another website that was longer ago, and I will usually do that source as well. But that happens between 1524 and 1525, and it's within that Holy Roman Empire, German states area. And these people are rebelling against like taxation and social inequality, economic inequality. They're attacking and like nobles and their homes, and burning down places like towns and villages and other higher level places, even like going to like churches and whatnot. And that's what prompts Martin Luther to speak out publicly in the thieving hordes, the murdering thieving hordes of the peasants document later on. So that's an event I would be aware of. You also have the Schmalkaldic War of 1546 to 47. Now remember, that extends from a group of princes, basically, that were all Protestant. So you had a Protestant group of princes that were called the Schmalkaldic League of Protestant Princes, which is, think of like a Justice League or like Marvel characters of like these princes that ruled over these states, but they were all Protestant, and there's going to be tension between those two. So think of these first two events here as further conflict of religious divide, but also fueled by social inequality, power struggles. So you can get that political, social, cultural effect in there too. And then we get to what I think is the most important of the three in terms of long-term impact, and that is the from 1562 all the way to 1598. It's a long period of time here. So for 36 years, you see the French Wars of Religion, and these were driven by the Reformation spread and the resulting political, social, and economic tensions. And to provide contextualization for this, understand that these wars require examining a broader social, economic, and political contexts of all of these. And if you go back to episode 8, you can see where, I think it was episode 8, or did I say 9 on that? I think it might have been 9. Episode 9, yes. And if you go back to episode 9, you can kind of see how complex the wars of religion really are. And one of those major ones I focus on is the French feuding, the French Catholics feuding with the Huguenots or the Huguenots in northern France. King Henry IV of France has to make a decision of doing the Edict of Nantes to put that conflict to an end, allowing religious toleration for the French Protestants, but he himself becoming a Catholic as well to appease others in that process. But again, go back to episode 9 or go watch Heimler or Emily Poole or anybody else that might, that you get more. If you don't learn from me, then definitely get from them. Maybe their voice resonates with you more than mine. But they're interesting, and it's still something that I want to study more, even after 5 years of teaching, and this being my 6th year. I still have gaps of knowledge with the French Wars of Religion. So remember, this is just a general overview. So to finish up this episode tonight, let's do that last couple of segments that we usually do. And that is, why is the Reformation important? We touched base on this there at the end of the last episode. But think about this, the Reformation was not just a religious movement. And that's one of the reasons why we study it in these kind of courses. It also led to the rise of state power. That right there is a perfect segue and transition into Unit 3, which is about absolute monarchs and constitutional republics. And it says the spread of literacy as well. Remember, the printing press plays a major role in the spread of the Reformation. We're going to see slowly over time, literacy rates will go up. And with that is usually standard of living going up, opportunities go up. Again, we have the feudalist system smashed. People are not just trapped and stuck in certain kind of roles. We also have the beginnings of modern science. And so that's going to be a great segue and transition for Unit 4 later when we do the scientific revolution. And ultimately, this shapes the modern Western world. Now, another historical reasoning skill would be of significance. And think of how the Reformation influenced subsequent other historical developments, like I said earlier. So not just the scientific revolution, but even the Age of Enlightenment and other modern democratic ideals and thought. Because like we'll see the decline of monarchs as well, and we'll get to more of these state governments represented by republics and prime ministers and presidencies like in America. So we get more of a democratic shift later on. We get into socialism later on and communism and all these other ideologies that we hit in the 17 and 1800s area. But we'll see people like John Locke write about that in the late 1680s as well. So to finish the episode, let's always finish with some questions that make you think, questions that make you dig a little deeper. So, and you can use these in class if you want to. And that is, think about if the Protestant Reformation had not occurred, how might the political landscape of Europe and the role of religion in governance look different today? So resonate on that a little bit. Would the church and state be more tied together today? Would they be less tied together? Would the church have more influence over political decisions that are going on? So if you think about it in terms of how our country runs or other countries around the world, if you're listening to this from different parts of the world, think about the church's role with the state today. Is it more secular? Is it more segregated from that today? So that's a really interesting discussion that I might try to do at the end of the unit, because I always like to end my units by giving them a study guide, which is basically like a list of some topics that we covered throughout the unit, and then we do another Socratic seminar digging deep into using the documents and evidence that we actually did. So the last question of the day, and then I will get out of your hair, and that is, can the Reformation be seen as a precursor to modern notions of individual rights and freedoms? Or did it primarily serve the interests of the emerging nation states? So is it really benefiting the nation states, the countries that are rising, and these monarchs that are going forward, and eventually those other governments? Or if you break it down to the level of the individual, it will eventually lead to arguments of things like natural rights from birth, like John Locke argued in the future in the 1680s. So think about those. I hope this episode has been enjoyable. Again, it's a little longer than the last episode. I really liked teaching about the Reformation. It wasn't that the topics are long, but I wanted to spend some time discussing the document of the week and the quote of the week. And obviously, if you don't like those, you can skip forward and go right into the main segment. So I hope that you all have a great rest of the weekend. And as always, be contagious.